Welcome back, eReads podcast listeners. It is your host, Liz, and welcome to my podcast where I talk about books, authorship, and all the different parts of the creative process. Today, I have Thomas, and we talk about poetry, and we even dive back into the world of memoir and how it's been a reflective process for him, how he's used it to tell different stories that delve into grief, depression, and even suicide. And so this is a really interesting and introspective episode. Please take care of yourself if you need to step away because you feel triggered. And let's jump right into the topic. So welcome, Thomas. I am really happy to have you on today.
Thank you, Liz. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yes. And so to welcome you, I always like to start off with what I call like a bookish question, which is just something around writing and books. And my question for you that I had was, I asked, my question was, what season describes your writing? So if you had to pick a season that most describes your writing, what would it be?
Oh, wow. What season? That's a great question. My first impulse, and this betrays the fact that I'm denying my age, I think, but the season seems to be late summer, maybe. That's what comes to mind. I don't know. It's when more.
Why that one?
I think because it's a time when things are kind of coming to fruition, and we're nearing harvest, and we're nearing the end of youth here and moving into more serious things. And so I think my writing, or the way that I like to think about my writing, is that I'm dealing with real life issues, I guess, but then also trying to be a little contemplative about it. So.
And I think that's really, really interesting because, you do talk about some hard things, grief being one of them. Can you please share, your journey about grief and how, you're discussing that through your writing?
Absolutely. I shortly after I published my first novel, I think within 3.5 weeks, my youngest son took his life. He'd been depressed for a while, and he'd not really let us in on it, and he'd not really let any of his friends in on it. And seems to be a pattern I've noticed with other people who are depressed that way. And and that started me. That happened in October of 2017, and that started me on a journey, really, Liz, where I at that time I considered myself a fiction writer. I'd written a novel, and at that point, though, I began journaling every day. It felt like journaling was my life-sustaining effort to try to stay, in the land of the living, so to speak. And that led to a lot of poetry then. And I decided that one way to not lose this is strange, but I mean, in losing a loved one, sometimes you want to do something to remember them and honor them. And I sort of felt like if I didn't write about him, I was going to lose him a second time. That's sort of the way it felt. And so I began to work on a memoir. And so the two areas of writing I've really been focusing on the most in the last several years has been writing poetry and writing memoir. And I know that poetry is something that a lot of people say in high school. I hate that.
Yes.
For me, I became an English major in college and had to do the usual analysis of poetry, but I also had some really effective teachers who showed me how they liked poetry, and I was able to learn from them and begin to really appreciate it. So.
So for folks that are listening and they feel intimidated by poetry, should they turn away from this conversation? Like, how would you describe poetry?
No, they should not turn away. The way I started in high school, I started to think about poetry as a kind of a decoding exercise. In this, the pipe means industry, and it's like as though you're trying to find symbols to decode a poem. And of course, I was never smart enough. The teacher had all of the correct answers, but I started to, I occasionally would run across a poem where I really could hear what the poem was saying about
Yeah.
someone's life, and it felt like it was really getting at something that was important and emotional. And that's how I began to think of it, and I had a really great poetry teacher in college who said, not every poem is going to appeal to you all the time. I mean, you're going to read some poems and you're not ready for them yet, but read the poems that you are ready for.
Oh, I love that. And I love the thought of them being like decoders, right? I don't know,
Yeah,
I just imagine you have your like decoder ring and you're trying to figure it out. And I
absolutely.
love that because sometimes you read a poem and it's just like it's pretty on face value, but then the more you look at it, the more there's there. And I think that's so
Yes,
fascinating.
absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Tell us about when you were crafting a poem. What
Mhm.
does that process look like? I only have like framework for, fiction work. What goes into
Yeah.
crafting a poem?
Yes. Poems, I sometimes it's like fiction. I have an idea for what I want it to say. I
Hmm.
have an idea for what this concept is. But sometimes it will take 4 or 5 drafts really to really begin to get at that. And I also there's a poet I really respect, Dana Goya. He refers to revision as creativity. So often we think of revision as correcting errors. The idea that revision is a time when we can still engage creatively is kind of freeing. Do you know what I mean?
It
And
is.
so yeah, so I was writing a poem, for example, about what came to mind was the day that we took some of my son's Hawaiian shirts back to Goodwill to give back. He'd bought them at Goodwill. We'd lost him, and then we were bringing these things back to Goodwill to give back. And I saw a poem in that for some reason. And so my original poem was we did this, and I was at the stage of grief where I was still having triggers, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I would really have emotional reactions to things. Well, I set that poem aside for a while and I came back to it again and I started to see something new in it that the way that my son had and his friends had all gone to Goodwill and kind of picked up all of these secondhand objects, and all of these used accessories and had, messed around with them and gave them a new life that they'd lost. And I sort of saw us as having a garage sale and opening up our garage, and then people doing that with my son's belongings. and
Yeah.
and that was it was a grief moment, but it was like I didn't see that originally in the poem, but I saw it in the fourth draft. I don't know if
Wow.
that makes sense, Liz, but that the poem works that way, I think. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. It makes me think of like, so sometimes in like, I tend to like pant or be what's known as like an intuitive writer. So like, I'll
Uh,
see something and I'll write it down, and then at the end, I'm like, oh, this is what it was about. This is what and like then I
yeah,
know, okay, this is what we need to intentionally bring out more. But absolutely, like,
yes.
I totally get the idea of crafting something, and then you're like, ah, this is what is coming out. This is what's beneath it. So that's amazing.
Absolutely. That's a good description for it, Liz. Yeah, the pantser idea that we discover as we
Yeah,
draft. Yeah. Yeah.
absolutely. Do your poems tend to be long? Do they tend to be short? Like, how do you kind of, what is your style like?
Yeah, mine tend to start out long. I and then they get longer and then they get shorter again. I have. It's very interesting. I When I began really seriously writing poetry, I wrote in what I would call an imagistic style. They were very short. It was mainly focused on imagery, and it would be very short and not much narrative. And now when I write it, there's more narrative in it. There's more linking and there's more development. But I recently wrote a poem that made me very happy about one of our cats, and it's only about 7 lines long, and it works that way. So I guess that
Like
I have.
Seven Lives of a Cat.
Oh yeah, I didn't think about that. Uh, I'll have to I'll have to look at that again. So yeah.
That is cool. But not only do you do poetry, but you do memoirs. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, memoir is such a wonderful uh, way of writing. I'm, a memoir is
You just realized your business needed to hire someone yesterday. How can you find amazing candidates fast? Easy. Just use Indeed. Stop struggling to get your job post seen on other job sites. With Indeed sponsored jobs, your post jumps to the top of the page for your relevant candidates, so you can reach the people you want faster. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs posted directly on Indeed have 45% more applications than non-sponsored jobs. Don't wait any longer. Speed up your hiring right now with Indeed. And listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/ARTS. Just go to Indeed.com/ARTS right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring? Indeed is all you need.
sometimes people mistake autobiography for memoir, telling the life story of someone.
Right.
Memoir is actually more like poetry in that it's focused on a particular season or a particular theme. It's focused on it. A memoir can actually be the length of a poem or a flash fiction, or it can be the length of a book. And I began seriously thinking about memoir when I started teaching it, and I've loved the personal essay.
Mm,
The way that we can develop our voice and do that. But memoir became especially important after my son died, and I found that I really had to write about him. I really
yeah.
had to figure out a way to um, um, do that. And I started, it really started as a journal where I was trying to write down everything I could remember immediately. And so over the last 2 or 3 years, every summer when I'm not teaching, I've been writing a draft of this.
Mm,
And as I've done this, I've discovered my grief changing, and I've begun to focus the memoir a little more on trying to really capture who my son was a little better,
yeah.
and also how my family reacted to things, and so I'm still, I think, in a process of discovering main themes for that. I think I'm, like you said, I'm a pantser and I have to discover things as I write. But I find memoir to be really, really rich and really enjoyable to write. It is creative in a different way than fiction is creative. It requires some of the same skills in narrative writing and scene development and
Mm,
writing dialogue, and description. It requires all those same skills, but in service to what you understand to be the truth about something. So, and I find that enjoyable.
absolutely. And you, memoirs can, so like you can craft a memoir about someone else. You mentioned like this is kind of like
Hmm.
in regards to your son. So, because I think a lot of times, okay, autobiography, you think about like yourself, but a memoir can be about something else or about a different season, as you said.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Some of the best memoirs I've read are about other people. This memoir writer wrote, at the back of it was the birth of his son, but he started out by writing about hummingbirds of all things. And I guess what it was his son had a heart issue.
Oh,
And so, but he begins by writing about the heartbeat of the hummingbird.
yeah.
If you're writing memoir, you can get into all of these interesting symbols. And so he wrote this fascinating, really involving memoir that moves from the bird to his son in a really powerful way, and it's all other focused. It's all very interesting.
Yeah, when you talk about it like that, I can definitely see the alignment between poetry and memoir
Yeah.
with the different symbolism and the depths of it. That's very pretty.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. If I could just quickly, I don't know, a nonfiction writer I really like. His name's Gay Talese. He
Hmm.
wrote for the New Yorker for years, I guess, and and or it might have been for the New York Times. And but he was on assignment to write an article about Frank Sinatra, and Frank Sinatra had a cold and was miserable and didn't want to talk to anyone. So Gay Talese sat across the tavern from him and just wrote about it. Was he wrote an essay titled "Frank Sinatra Has a Cold." It's it's really a fun essay to read, and it's all focused on Frank Sinatra though, and on his life and on his issues, all of his issues. So yeah.
That's really interesting. I got to look into memoirs a little bit more. I think that is, again, just really interesting how, I don't know, this like almost like a drop in the ocean, how like one thing can ripple into a lot of different things. And I think that's like really cool.
Yes. Oh, that's a good description. I like that.
You got the
Yeah.
poetry brain flowing.
Yeah. Yeah. You've got to channel this. You can, yeah.
Right. So, Thomas, tell us a little bit about like if someone wanted to dabble into poetry or craft a poem, what are
Mhm.
like the parts or elements, like things that they should consider when, crafting one?
Yeah. I think the first thing everyone notices is that the lines are different. And maybe one of the first things to focus on is, um, and I know that lots of poets will differ on this, but there is the length of the line, and there is the sound of the language, and um, there's a way in which you can make the lines sort of um, end just with a key word that leads into the next line,
Mm.
so that that. And I think it's a good idea to start with. And I know that people differ on whether poetry should rhyme or not. I mean, I've heard people in bookstores say, "Oh, there's no criteria for good poetry," and I think they mean that poetry doesn't rhyme anymore. Maybe, but I think that there's one of the things I love experimenting with is having a rhyme appear in my poem, but it's not end rhyme. Like there will be a word like sphere in the middle of line 2, and then at the end of line 4 I'll use the word here or something like that.
Oh, nice.
The ear picks that up.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But it's something that you just find yourself playing with, to begin with. And yeah, and I think that poetry can be coming from our observations. It can come from experiences we've had. It can come from images that come to us. And I would just encourage a little free play with that and experimentation. The thing that I did also was I kept reading poets, but I would always try to find poets I liked.
Mm.
And yeah, and those poets who I really like their voice and what they're writing about, and I just keep reading them and studying them. And then lately I've sort of gotten into form, like the sonnet and the villanelle and some things like that. But those are challenging to write. Yeah.
Absolutely. And in thinking about memoirs again, like, how do you know where the story is? What should be a memoir versus maybe an autobiography? Any kind of like thoughts or in regards to that?
Yeah. The autobiography, the main focus will be on telling a life.
Mm.
It will be um, uh, exploring the influences of a person's life,
Right.
what led them, what led them to do what they did. And autobiography is often focused on again life events that come together. Memoir is for example, I wrote one piece of memoir that was based on my first job I had in high school. I worked in a rundown diner, in the downtown area where I lived, and it was about time I got exposed to real poverty and to real um, um, people really struggling, and out of that first job, I decided to write about that, and about how privileged I'd been, and how protected I'd been, and my first reactions to it, and how I learned to stop reacting as a typical middle class white person, and to begin to think about what was really going on there. And so the memoir was really about me changing, I think, but it was, and it was about, and it was, um, so yeah, your original question, Liz, about story is a really good one. Vivian Gornick has this book called The Situation and the Story. The situation is the baseball game, or in my case, the rundown diner. The story is the homeless person I encountered. The story is the time with my father at the baseball game when I discovered that something I hated about him was actually not something he could help, and I learned to love him, or something like that. Does that make sense? And
It does.
yeah, and I
Yeah,
think
it
that
does.
I think the story can, you know, um, I think I did the story in a short story form with the diner, where I first I was observing how people I was working with were chasing away the homeless, and I had an encounter with a homeless person, and I discovered something about that, and I started leaving food out for them, and my boss didn't like that at all, and I got in trouble for it, but I, but I changed anyway. So yeah, yeah.
Yeah. In thinking about change, it makes me think how both poetry and memoirs are like a reflective process. And um, and in writing, a lot of times, whether you're doing fiction and you're writing about characters that are all in your head or something nonfiction, right?
Mhm,
Like you go to these emotional places. And
mhm,
I'm wondering, as you wrote about grief, a very personal grief,
mhm,
what strategies do you have for folks that might be afraid to like go there to that emotional place? Are there things that you did that were
mhm.
really helpful to like have that balance that helped you kind of transition in and out of that place? Like any advice or thoughts about that?
That's a really good question. For me at the time, I was really wanting. For me, writing was actually a kind of not salvation, but it presented a guardrail for me. By writing about it, I could begin, as you said, it causes reflection, and that
Yeah.
reflection became, what it did for me was it took, the real nebulous feelings of dread and of
Mm.
just sadness and just loss, and as I put it into language, those words began to become kind of little life rafts to me, to kind of keep me
Yeah.
afloat. You know what I mean? Yeah, I've heard one person describe grief as being dropped into an ocean, and you're far from the shores that you're far from all of that, and you can't go back to it. I mean, as much as you want to, and so the only way is forward,
Right.
and you can't even see the shore you're going toward, and that sort of felt overwhelming, and so I think that some things that helped me weren't had nothing to do with writing, but it helped me to be with friends. I had some good friends who were supportive in my grief. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
I also was attending a survivors of suicide meeting regularly every 2 weeks, and that really was a lifesaver for me. It helped me to see that I wasn't alone in it. And
Yeah.
as we talked with each other, I think conversations probably helped me then when I sat down to write, because I really agree with you. I mean, it's really easy to feel overwhelmed as you begin to reflect on things that have happened. But I think that with friendships and with a support group, I was able to begin to write in a very therapeutic way. And so, but I wouldn't write for too long about it. I would write paragraphs and maybe a few pages, and then look at those, and think about them. Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah, that's such a good
Absolutely,
question.
Night. Yeah, and it's such a good answer. I think it is really important to have, your group of people that help to pull you back, right? Again, whether you are doing the fear factor of horror, the intimacy of a love scene, the sadness of grief. You sometimes go to these places and it can be exhausting. And so to have those things that pour back into you as you're pouring into your writing, I think is so critical.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. All those different scenes you could, I would have trouble with writing horror right now, but it was difficult.
But also thank you for discussing grief and writing about it, because
Yeah.
as you had mentioned, like, it's a part of life, and I think we get afraid to talk about it, but we
Hmm.
need to talk about it because then, like, we're all hurting. And so I just thank you for like tackling this and tackling it in an authentic way. And you mentioned like the different seasons of it, right? It changes over time. It changes over moments. And so
Yes.
again, just thank you for like highlighting and being vulnerable enough to go there with your writing for everyone to see.
Well, thank you. Yeah, it's been a real journey, and I'm glad to share about it. It's very meaningful. Yeah.
Absolutely. Please share, where can people find your writing? How can they connect with you?
Oh, that's great. I have a website. It's my first and last name run together, thomasallbaugh.com. And my books are all there. But you can find, I have a collection of short stories called Subtle Man Loses His Day Job, and that's on Amazon. It's on Amazon.com. It's a
What is
collection of
that about?
well, Subtle Man Loses His Day Job is about a man in his 30s who thinks that his superpower is subtlety. And he runs into lots of issues with that because, as we know, superheroes are out there, they're out front and they're powerful. And being subtle is, you're going to get missed a lot. And I have two stories in here about his struggles and his relationship with his girlfriend and things like that. But then I also have a number of other stories about other characters, and they're kind of centered around uh, a place called the Sidestep Tavern. It's kind of a combination of several taverns I've known in my life, and so certain people collect there, and it's so. And then there are some sort of autobiographical stories as well, So.
Lovely.
Yeah, and I also have a chapbook of poems called "The View from January," and this has the first poems that I wrote after we lost my son Michael. This
Mm,
has some of those first, but this also has poems I've been writing before then too. And again, this is on Amazon.com as well. And, yeah, I'm on Twitter too, Liz. If I'd love to meet and talk with people on Twitter if they're available. It's Tallbaugh, TALLBAUGH1. I guess that, yeah. So
lovely. And if you missed any of that, it will be in the episode show notes. So make sure you check out that so you can get all this information. Um, Thomas, thank you so very much for coming on the show. Um,
thank
any
you.
like yeah, any like last words for folks, like about anything, like anything that you'd like to leave people knowing?
Um, yes, I sort of think that I think it's important to think about writing as not something that you need to have be perfect. I
Mm.
think the writing, as I share with some of my friends, I try to write one bad poem a day, because a bad poem is something I can keep working on, if that
Oh,
makes sense.
yeah.
Revision, I think, unlike life where things happen and that's about it, with writing, we can revise, we can return, and yeah. So, but
That takes the scary out of it.
it does. It does. It takes away writer's block and all the scary. Yes. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thomas, you have been absolutely wonderful. Thank you for stopping by. Thank you so very much, and please come back to the show anytime.
Thank you.